Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is your program bringing you news, views, discussion, and insight on religious liberty events in the US and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty Magazine, and my guest on the program, Greg Hamilton, president of the Northwest Religious Liberty Association and a repeat offender on this program. And appreciate your input always.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the United States. I said worldwide, which we often cover, but let's talk about the US and rights. This is a nation of rights, right?
Yeah, I believe so. But you know, when policemen march down the streets in St. Louis and say against the protesters, "We own these streets," I'm reminded of the fact that no, peacefully protesting citizens own these streets, and it's the police that are servants of the citizenry. So I think that we're getting things backwards today. For some reason, we Americans are more and more loving authoritarianism.
Absolutely.
And that's a problem.
And you're talking about protesting. Where I first started my heckle started to rise was 2 administrations ago. I think it started because the inauguration of that George Bush, to name the president, was a bit contentious, and he had to ride instead of walk down Pennsylvania. But shortly after that, they started roping off areas, sometimes a mile from the event at hand, where you could freely speak. They were called free speech zones, only within the enclosure. Right. I thought, man, at the very least, it's like 1984, where up is now down. You know, the language has changed, but what it amounts to is free speech is gone, or at least in principle.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think of Christ's injunction in Matthew 7:12, where he said, "So in everything do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets."
It's the golden rule.
It's a golden rule, and that's a very hard ideal to live up to, but it's what we're called to do. And I'll never forget when I was a kid growing up in 1976, Jimmy Carter had just been elected president, and my dad was riding in the back of a pickup truck with his best friend, and his best friend had 2 guns in his gun rack and a window open that slided open, and I was able to listen to their conversation. And his question was, well, is Jimmy Carter the one to bring about national Sunday laws? And you know, I just thought, oh, this is typical sport among us Seventh-day Adventists. You know, okay, the next president, is he the one that's going to bring about Sunday laws? And I thought that was interesting. And then he said this: a deep philosophical discussion took place about whether or not as Christians we should view our constitutional right as privileges and not as rights that we should demand. In fact, the conversation awakened something in me, and I'm glad that my dad, being a Lincoln Republican, disagreed. He basically said that kind of apathy creates a problem. It creates feelings of superiority that, you know, if we should only view our rights as privileges and not as rights, what does that do? It leads to abuse. To me, the claim that somehow we're obsessed with rights means that, well, we're going to deny somebody else their rights. And it's easy to say as a white American male to say that, because then I don't want to recognize all the hard work it's taken for our nation to get to the path we are on now in terms of where we've come in terms of our nation of rights. Yeah. They were hard fought for. Whether you look at the American Revolution, whether you look at the Civil War, whether you look at Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction period, you look at the Civil Rights Movement, you look at the Jim Crow laws, the Civil Rights Movement, and where we've come as a nation, it's been hard fought. And a lot of people have deserved to have access to those Bill of the People's Rights, so to speak, those rights under the First Amendment and all the amendments.
Well, we're forgetting the dynamic between the ruled and the ruler, and we're drifting toward an autocratic view of government, which naturally takes away rights. And I think we're also forgetting where that comes from. I mean, Jefferson famously said inalienable rights by virtue of what was his term? Nature and nature's God, wasn't it?
Yes.
You can debate forever exactly his view on religion, but I think he meant the God that's covered by the Bible creator, but he didn't want to make it sound too narrow. But you know, if we don't, unless we go back to that, then we're just in legal constructs that move according to the sentiments of the time.
Oh, yeah.
And I think this is what you want to get at in your discussion.
Oh, absolutely. And in a sinful world, our nation of equal rights is the best we can actually hope for. I believe these constitutional rights are a safeguard against discrimination, dictatorship, and tyranny. And I believe, Lincoln, that apathy is what causes people to relax and allow untold discrimination and injustice to thrive. And I think that's kind of where our country is at.
Sometimes apathy, sometimes privilege.
Yes, that too.
Like we live in a first world situation, right?
Yeah.
We're not uninformed about the third world.
Yeah.
But are we greatly motivated to equalize things and to recognize those rights? Most people not, because why would we disadvantage ourselves for an abstraction that we know it's there, but we're not moved?
Eleanor Roosevelt, the author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a universal standard, but nevertheless in terms of international law, but she says, where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on many maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have any meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerned citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. And I think of our own nation here. You know, if our apathy says, well, okay, you know, everybody has their rights, and you know, why demand them? You know, you're just a troublemaker if you demand your rights. I think that creates a problem. That, you know, when certain groups of people and/or an individual is deprived of their rights under the law, we should take notice.
Well, let me throw up a real everyday example in the negative. It seems to me certain public statements were made about Puerto Rico after the relatively recent disaster that reflect this sort of hierarchy of rights.
That these countries come from a certain round circle.
Yeah, no, but most people dismissed it as just a political faux pas or a bad public statement, but underneath it lay exactly what we're talking about here. And I hadn't realized that Eleanor Roosevelt wrote that way, because she's absolutely right. You've got to see it immediate as a part of a society. It's hard in the abstract. And it connects with what I've noticed on television. What are some of the groups? Save the Children or these different types of things. They'll have ads where there's a single child, you know, pus running down their eyes or whatever, and flies buzzing around. Help this child. People respond to that because they can personalize it.
Yeah.
And that's fine. That's our human nature. But somehow we need to get through to people to see it in the theoretical, that the people that are not next door to them or in the trailer park, say across the street or something like that, that they're all as deserving and have the same right to life, liberty, and happiness as anyone else.
Oh, absolutely.
And that was part of the genius of the framers. They recognized it, or at least formulated it and put it down as an ideal.
A 2010 Baylor University study suggested that religion itself may be a contributing factor. This is coming from the most elite, largest, most influential Baptist university in the world. And the study, published in the Journal of Social, Psychological, and Personality Science, found that people subliminally primed with Christian words or phrases reported more negative attitudes about African Americans than those primed with neutral words. What's interesting about the study is that it shows some component of religion does lead to some negative evaluations of people based on race, said Wade Rawat, the professor who conducted the study. One possible explanation, one that consistently came up in the research, is that because America's religious traditions are so influenced by Puritanism, people responding to religious terms may be drawing on ideals like the Protestant work ethic which has been shown to activate anti-black attitudes, including the phrase constitutional privileges, a phrase often used by evangelicals to evoke their disdain for equal rights.
Well, there's probably a line you can draw on that too. But when they say religion, it's what I'm trying to bring out. There's a world of difference between religion and spirituality. And religion has long been the cover for all sorts of biases and prejudices and racism in particular.
Yes, well, that's what the study points out.
But if it's expressed wrongly, it looks like religion is the problem.
Right. No,
the organization of religion is facilitating irreligious people indulging their natural tendencies.
This professor's not making that argument.
And what does the Bible say? True religion is this. What was it? It had to do with loving God and loving justice for your fellow man.
Yes. Well, and that's essentially what the 14th Amendment suggests as well. What does the 14th Amendment, Section 1 say? All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor to deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And you know, when you look at our nation and all the Supreme Court rulings that have been handed down, we've come a long ways. And
but that goes back a long way. That's almost the exact same language as from Runnymede, the Magna Carta. That was the original burden against your rights not being granted and subject to arbitrary arrest, imprisonment, personal abuse, loss of property, and all the rest. It's been the struggle of Western law, and the U.S. has continued it. How do you protect the landless or the non-aristocrat who doesn't have an army or a posse or whatever? And even now, I think we're in deep trouble because I have seen, since Watergate particularly, in the U.S., you don't get good justice unless you're wealthy, connected, or whatever, and people that ran foul of the powers that be, they would be litigated into poverty, and the already poor cannot even get a good hearing in the courts. The public defenders often don't care. I mean, it's a good concept, but you don't get a good level of justice if you're without means in the U.S. So we're paying lip service to this, but we're already far along in differing justice for different people, different rights for different people. And how that can be resolved, I don't know. And as you know, at the moment, we're clearly in a very telling apparent debate, or it is a real debate, but an apparent conflict between gay rights and religious rights.
Right.
And on one level, I think it's a fight that shouldn't have been joined by ostensible Christians, because Christian charity should rule the day. But when you run those rights head to head, someone's going to lose. And either way, I don't think it's good for the overall application of human rights.
I think the courts, you know, they've got time to sort that out. I think in time...
Well, they've taken their time.
Well, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when it was passed, I mean, African Americans are still, the courts are still sorting out, you know, what are the parameters of their rights and in terms of equal justice. And so it's taken a long time to counterbalance.
Well, it says on Title 7, or Article 7, it says you can't be discriminated against on the basis of sex. Right now, we're debating gender. We're debating what gender is. It's very so we're further away, and I'm not pro the whole gender bender issue at all, but legally it's created a miasma, a legal miasma in my view.
Oh, I agree.
That has to bleed into other rights issues.
But it's a challenge for the courts, and that's what they have to wrestle with.
Is it really?
Yeah.
The courts are dealing with it, but I think it's society at large that's struggling with these issues and doesn't understand rights clearly.
Well, they didn't understand it even after Brown versus Board of Education in 1951. And so even there, I mean, the Supreme Court came up with a ruling, and the political powers that be, the president and federal marshals, had to exact justice for black people.
Let's take a break, and we'll come back with Brown v. Board of Education right after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Liberty Insider. Before the break, with guest Greg Hamilton, we were talking about rights and Brown v. Board of Education. Just tell people very clearly what that case was.
Well, it eliminated discrimination.
It was aimed to eliminate it.
In public schools. Yeah, that was the ruling, that that segregation was essentially a violation of the 14th Amendment.
And that lay behind two things, I think, didn't it? Or maybe I've got it wrong. One, I know for sure, the picture of that little African-American girl
Yes.
with the police taking her up the stairs to school
Right.
against the objections.
And Governor Wallace saying that
standing on the steps.
Yeah, we will not let the federal authorities dictate over us as a state.
But I think it led directly, although there was another court case that mandated it to school busing, which was part of forced desegregation, which was itself a problem.
Yes, but that was still overarching. The ruling was overarching in terms of segregation altogether.
But what I'm trying to introduce in it, there can be a problem, but sometimes the solution can bring in another problem almost as bad.
Yes, but what's the other problem that's almost as bad? I mean, the police show up, the marshals show up, and the state guard was there, and it was like a showdown. But they had to stand aside, and they did.
Well, I was thinking about busing, where you relocate populations out of their area.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah,
because that's sort of shades of Stalinism. That's what Stalin did in Russia.
Right.
And people died when they were sent radically from one end of the Soviet Union.
Well, and that's where systemic injustice comes. I mean, systemic racism. I mean, one fix leads to maybe more problems, maybe lesser but still problems, and that may be the case. So clearly, especially when you see neighborhoods in one section of a community, they obviously have been sectored off.
Well, let me throw in a thought. Religious liberty has been called the first freedom, and isn't there a magazine, First Things? And I think they're playing on that. But I know, and I'm back to what bothered me when I first came into religious liberty, practically every religious liberty law and many other laws has a little clause in it that this is so, freedom of religion or whatever, unless there is a compelling government interest.
Right, compelling governmental interest.
So we're talking about a right. You think it's an absolute right or a standalone right, but government at least always reserves the right to throw it out when they choose.
But a compelling governmental interest is so very hard to meet. It's still a very high bar.
The courts have put it that way, but again, it's not an absolute, it's someone's determination. It might be a lower bar in time of emergency.
It still provides protection against minorities.
There's protection, and I've talked to lawyers, and we're not about to take that out, but it does trouble me, and it's at least a historical reminder that outside divinely instituted and administered rights, human understanding of rights is a little bit changeable, variable according to the dynamic of the human experience, not absolute.
No, of course not. I mean, and nobody's suggesting that they are absolute in every case and in every sense. But I think that the ideal is something we're striving for.
Of course, ideals are always worth striving for.
Yes, but in law and in practice. I don't mean just as an ideal not to be carried out. I mean, even if it's gradual, as long as there's progress, you've heard of the progressive movement. As long as there's progress, then I think that's a good thing.
But let me quote from my own editorial recently. Well, actually, in my editorial, I quoted from the musical Popeye. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't.
It's cute. And in the musical, Popeye comes ashore in his rowboat from being drifting at sea, and he's looking for his father, as it turns out. But he lands at this little self-satisfied community that's absolutely dysfunctional, and they sing a song. They say, "Sweet Haven, God must love us." And then in other words, they are the blessed of God. And it was a highly symbolic musical. And then promptly, Popeye is taxed for stepping ashore. He's fined at every point. He's not allowed. Walking wasn't allowed. There's a divine thing. They've got all the rights, but they're not going to give them to anyone else. And You know, rights and religious liberty rights are subject to too many vagaries, in my view. We need to uphold the ideal, but not be under illusion that any state, in my view, this is a deeply held view, no state is going to go to the, is going to threaten its own viability to guarantee your right. Basically, it's a matter of convenience for the state to give you that right. More in very convenient times, it will give it gladly. And in stressful times, as in England in World War II, to get a friendly state, Germany and other places, they start to...
I believe the rollback of civil rights, little by little, is the precursor to the attack on religious freedom rights.
Of course.
And I think we don't take that seriously enough. When we see systemic injustice carried out against African Americans, do we take that seriously as an affront against ourselves or not?
Because it's a change in the attitude of how one group of humans see other human beings. And that's easily transferable to another thing they might differ on, religion. You know, it's been pointed out, I think very correctly, that this, you know, with all of the prejudices that float through the human race, I mean, the human beings, racism, yes, is a very pernicious one, but it's made more pernicious because people look different, easy to identify. But we are prejudicial in many other areas. It's a little more subtle to identify someone that thinks differently than you, either politically or religiously. That's not on first sight. So racism is like the canary, in my view, is like the canary in the mine. But you will notice it first, but it's not the only problem. And the end result of all of this is the dissipation of a whole waterfront of rights.
Well, let me bring up another example. You know, you've seen the kneeling football players before football games. You know,
you mean the ones that the president condemned? Yeah.
Let me ask this question. Defending the Constitution and everyone's equal constitutional right to free speech, is that more important? Or coercing others through peer pressure or threat of unemployment to worship the flag? And you know, that to me is a very important question, because, you know, if you deny free speech, even on the job, okay, in that kind of, and they're kneeling to protest systemic racism in the country. They're not kneeling to condemn the troops. They're not kneeling to condemn the flag and that sort of thing. And the reason why I bring that up about flag worship is this, and nation worship. The United States has already faced this test in 2 U.S. Supreme Court rulings involving the constitutional right of Jehovah's Witnesses to politely refuse to pledge allegiance to the flag in public school classrooms. Cantwell versus Connecticut in 1940 and West Virginia versus Barnett 1943. Even the Seventh-day Adventist Church took the lead in defending their right before the High Court. Yeah. So, and the Supreme Court has ruled many times that even flag burning is constitutional. Not that I'm advocating for that, I'm very much against that. But that's not the point. The point is that it is constitutional.
I remember hearing Scalia once in person talking about that, and he says his own wife vilified him when he got home. How dare you take that? And he had to tell his own wife why he had to defend the right of burning the flag, even though he found it abhorrent.
But my question is, troops, when you think about, are those football players trying to insult the troops? No. The troops' attitude is, or it should be, at least I've heard a lot of troops say this, hey, we're there to defend the Constitution. What's more important, the Constitution or the flag? And I point out to people...
I'll even differ from you. We should, I mean, I'm a Vietnam era person, yes, and I didn't go to Vietnam in the end. My number never came up. It was horrible the way the military were treated back then, the draftees. But be careful of the opposite. Why are we duty-bound to be flag raisers for the military? They're like anyone else, and in anyone else in a free society, they can be criticized. But we're creating a hierarchy where they're above criticism, and that's not good for all civil liberty and rights.
What I was trying to say is that, yeah, and exactly what you're saying is what I was trying to say, is that when it comes to the flag versus the Constitution, the soldiers say, hey, we go and fight wars and die for the lone crazy in our country to defend their constitutional rights.
And that's how it should be.
And that's how it should be. But a lot of people don't view it that way. And so they're viewing this whole idea of rights as something that's a privilege and not a right.
Absolutely. And very good point, confusing rights with privilege.
And that's a problem. We have rights and we need to defend them, folks. They're not just privileges. Remember that. We are a nation of rights. Otherwise, there would be tyranny.
When the Apostle Paul came into conflict with the authorities, it's very telling that he used his citizenship and the rights that went with it to support his evangelistic effort. But it's very important to realize, as you can see from his writings, that that was not the basis for why he was preaching and indeed why he was imprisoned. In fact, in imprisonment, he said he was imprisoned because of the resurrection from the dead. We need to defend what sometimes is called natural rights. We have a right under God for certain freedoms. Religious liberty is a prime one. We should never imagine that such basic eternal rights originate with and depend upon the authority of civil governance for their execution. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.